What is domestic violence?
Anytime you're in a relationship and somebody takes power and control over the other person. This could be either physically, emotionally, verbally, sexually, psychologically. It's anytime somebody tries to establish or coerce control over another person. Nobody's exempt from it. It's something that affects lots of different populations, lots of different people. I'm sure everybody can say that they've known somebody who's experienced domestic violence to some degree. Certainly, we believe that it only exists between a man and a woman, with the male being the aggressor and the female being the victim. Certainly, we have known that it is something that can affect men as well, and certainly, the LGBTQ population.
What are the signs of being in an abusive situation?
Obviously, any threat or physical violence, any threat of force, either sexually or physically, emotional abuse, telling somebody that they're ugly, putting them down, calling them stupid, making them feel as though they're less than. It could include stalking. Things with technology has certainly come a long way, with having to be in constant contact, constantly having to report to the other person where you are, having that other person control where you can go, who you can hang out with, things of that nature.
How can I support a friend or family member that's experiencing domestic violence?
The best way to support somebody who's in an abusive relationship, who discloses that they are in an abusive relationship, would be to hear what they're saying, first of all, to be an active listener, to validate for them that what they're going through is not okay. A lot of times people who are in these relationships don't necessarily realize that it's wrong. They sort of excuse the behavior away by saying, oh, he or she just had a bad day, or, he or she is really stressed. So validating for them that, what you're going through is not okay. And then encouraging them to reach out to the proper people to support. I know we might want to force somebody or try to force somebody to get help, or maybe go and make that phone call for them, but it's really important that that person that's in that circumstance reaches out for help themselves. They need to do it when they're ready. And the reason for that is because they have somebody controlling their life as it is. For somebody else to take control of their life would be very detrimental to them at that point. I mean, sometimes, especially in domestic violence circumstances, people don't always, it's not something that people like to talk about. It's always very difficult to talk about anything that's, any type of relationship stuff, familial issues. I would say that the best thing to do to help support somebody would be to, bring it to their attention. I've noticed that you've seemed withdrawn lately. I've noticed that your eating habits have changed, or you look tired. Is there something going on? Just being able to be there for somebody and provide that support without being pushy or without being forceful. I think that's really the best way to, support somebody in those circumstances, because it's difficult. And a lot of people don't want to come forward and say, hey, my marriage or my relationship, this is what's going on. So if you notice something, I think the best thing to do would just be to bring it up. I think one of the most important things for anybody in a relationship to keep in mind, regardless of what your age is, regardless of what your gender or your sexual orientation, I think the main thing to keep in mind is that if you're uncomfortable with something that's going on in your relationship, or if you're uncomfortable with something that's going on in a friend's relationship, that's something to pay attention to. I think your gut is really going to speak volumes, and sometimes we don't always listen to that, and sometimes we want to just push that to the back of our minds and say, no, I'm overreacting, or I'm overanalyzing the situation. But certainly there are red flags at the beginning of every relationship that sometimes we're just, in that honeymoon phase, we're not paying attention to it. But those are certainly things that you want to pay attention to. And I would advise anybody who's not currently in a relationship that before you get into a relationship, just make a list of things that you want in a relationship and things that you don't want. Because if you start thinking about it ahead of time, you're less likely to tolerate some of the behaviors that, would happen in those sorts of relationships.
What are some red flags or warning signs?
It's different depending on the relationship, but I would certainly say that some of the red flags would be, having to be in excessive contact with that person, always having to report to them, or feeling as though you have to report to them. Anytime somebody's opinions are sort of dictative of what your action should be or what your clothing type should be. Trying to isolate you from friends and family, even though in the beginning it may not seem that way, because in the beginning of a relationship, it's natural you want to spend a lot of time together, you want to only spend time with that one person. But it's important to pay attention to, well, what is this really about? Is this because they're really excited to see me, or is it because, they're trying to stop me from doing all of the other things? Anybody that just has a lot to say about, your job, your extracurricular activities, your schooling, somebody who just kind of comes across as overbearing, and you get that feeling of, what's this really about? I would say those are definitely some of the big ones that we see. And technology, the phone calls, having to give your phone to your partner so that they can look through your text messages and your phone logs, or giving somebody your Facebook passwords. Those things are all things that, at initial glance, we may not see anything wrong with them, but certainly it's starts to begin the controlling abusive behavior.
Can domestic violence contribute to other things like depression and anxiety?
So certainly anytime somebody's feeling subjected to these kinds of relationships where there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of toxicity, it's a lot of chaos most of the time. Those circumstances can certainly lead to a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, those withdrawn feelings that I was talking about earlier, when you notice somebody's kind of not doing the same thing that they normally do. And we do see it boil down to where the fact that somebody just can't get out of bed, or because somebody just loses their job, or they can't pay the bills because they're so overwhelmed with this fear of, their partner coming home, or them doing the wrong thing, or them not cleaning the house, appropriately, or not having food on the table, when that person walks in the door. It certainly can lead to a lot of other issues. And, when you think about trauma in terms of being complex, it's usually not just one circumstance. Usually these people are, have child abuse in their histories as, when they were growing up, or they have this substance abuse component that we were just talking of, and certainly can spiral and snowball into much bigger issues.
Is someone who has suffered abuse as a child more likely to become attracted to an abusive personality or become an abuser?
But I believe that we are what we're conditioned to. We when we grow up in an environment that's abusive and toxic, and there's a lot of yelling and there's a lot of toxicity and chaos, I feel like we sort of breed that in our other, as we grow up and as we age. And there is certainly, some statistics or evidence that point to the fact that somebody who's in an abusive relationship once will kind of continue to be attractive to that, because that's what they've been conditioned to know. And if somebody, finds themselves in a loving relationship, it's almost like they don't really know what to do with it, because it's not common for them. They're sort of craving that chaos, if that sounds, I know that sounds crazy, but they sort of crave that animosity and that chaos and that toxicity. So if somebody, is in an abusive relationship, the best way to sort of counteract that would be to have some sort of an intervention, whether it's attending individual counseling or attending groups, or just sort of having that be facilitated in some way so that you can figure out what the attraction was to that relationship in the first place, and how do you, how you sort of came out of it on the other side.
Are there parameters taken to ensure someone's safety after they try to separate from their situation?
So anytime we have a client that walks in our office, or that we meet out in the field, and whether it's court or at any of the law enforcement offices, we always do our own safety plan with that client. And it's not necessarily something that we write down, but it's something that we sort of go over. Do you feel safe when you go home? What are some of the concerns that you might have? Who do you feel like you can talk to that's, in your immediate area, that if you needed to reach out for help, that they would be there? We sort of always do that with everybody across the board, just because we don't really know what kind of circumstance, we're walking into. But we always make sure that the client's in control of their own destiny. And we would never want to force somebody to get an order of protection when that may not be in their best interest. That's one of the things that's kind of unique about what we do, is that we really believe in a client's right to self-determination and their right to be able to make their own decisions, because the fact of the matter is they already have one person controlling their every move, and they need to be able to feel like they can make their own decisions. And they also know their situation better than we do. I've only met this person for 10 minutes. How am I going to tell him or her what's best for them? They really need to be driving the bus in that circumstance. But certainly, when somebody does make a decision to leave, or makes a decision to even sort of step up that balance and separate the power and control in that circumstance, that's their most vulnerable point. That's usually when the threat of violence becomes greater. So we do have certain safety precautions that we utilize. Like I said before, accessing, family court for orders of protection has been great. In a lot of circumstances where you can, tell somebody you have to stay away within 500 feet and you're not allowed to contact this person. Doesn't work for everybody. At the end of the day, it's a piece of paper, but sometimes in some circumstances, that's all somebody needs to be able to say, okay, I'm going to abide by this. And certainly we do have a 15-bed shelter that's in an undisclosed location that anybody who's a victim of domestic violence can access. There's a different shelter in every county, so if our shelter is full, there are other shelters that they can refer to for those circumstances, and they do accommodate children as well, and they'll bus them to, their specific districts, and it's another way.
What are the services your organization provides?
Our organization provides, like I said before, free and confidential individual counseling where somebody can come in and meet with a therapist once a week, twice a week, however often they need to. We also offer various groups throughout the week. Our legal team, our advocate team offers a legal clinic once a month for people to come in and answer, to ask legal questions. And then we also provide the victim advocacy piece as well as community education to community organizations.
What are some problems you see when someone comes forward? What are some problems with the system?
Sure. Besides the time factor, I would say that one of the biggest issues or downfalls of accessing the court in general would be that the victim now has to face their abuser. Sometimes in certain circumstances, the abuser's been removed from the home and that physical contact has been separated. So when you go to court, there's no way to keep that separation because, the criminal justice system just isn't set up that way. And sometimes that's very detrimental to a client that I'm working with, especially if that person's incarcerated and now they have to see them, in the courtroom. It can be very re-triggering. It can be very re-traumatizing. So I would say is definitely one thing. And it's a very long process. It can be very tedious and, especially for clients that don't come from a higher
What inspired you to become a victim advocate?
It's actually an interesting story. When I was 16 and I was in high school, I believe I was a sophomore or junior in high school, I actually went through a really difficult time. And I had seen a guidance counselor at school, and she had referred me to the Women's Center because at that time I was doing some cutting. I was doing some self-injurious behavior. So she had referred me to a counselor over at the Women's Center. I saw that therapist for approximately a year, and she really saved my life. When I graduated from college, probably 4 or 5 years later, I saw a job posting online I had gone to school for social work, for psychology and for social work because of the experience that I had at the Women's Center and meeting that therapist and going through that whole circumstance. So when I graduated college, I applied for the job as a community educator, got the job on a part-time basis, sort of going around to different schools and different community agencies, educating them about dating violence, domestic violence, bullying, things like that. And I guess the rest is sort of history. I ended up going back for my master's in social work and have been employed at the Women's Center as a victim advocate for the last 4 years.
If you could give yourself advice knowing what you know now to yourself back when you were going through that difficult time, what would you tell yourself?
I would tell myself to reach out for help sooner. I knew that some of the stuff that was going on wasn't necessarily okay, but I wasn't really sure where to go with the information. I guess I really wasn't validated that what was going on wasn't okay, and I sort of wished I would have reached out for help a lot sooner.
Advice would you give yourself if you knew what you know now?
I would say that I would reach out for help a lot sooner. I guess I knew internally that what was going on in my life wasn't okay, but I wish I would have had somebody validate for me that, it really wasn't okay. And I wish I would have reached out for help a lot sooner because it maybe wouldn't have gotten as bad as it did at that point. And just knowing that somebody, cared enough to help you through that circumstance. And I think that's why the Women's Center is so great and so monumental in this community, is that it really just provides a holding space for all of that stuff that somebody's going through. Even if, somebody only shows up one time, just to be able to have a place to put all of your feelings and all of the emotions that you've been experiencing over the last however long it's been, I think it's really helpful, and I know it was very helpful to me.